Hello everyone, my name is Mary Eva and we're here today with author Laurie Weber, who has written quite a few books, and our students here at Heritage Regional High School, one of the secondary 5 creative writing class, is reading her latest verse novel, Yellow Mini. So welcome, Laurie, to Heritage. You've already had 2 sessions here today. The first one with a very humongous group of students, secondary 3 and 1 secondary 5. Both of them were sports groups, but they actually were quite interested in all of your books. Just to give you a little bit of background here, Laurie was born here in Montreal, but she spent quite a few years in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So she has quite a bit of information. You told the students that something influenced you quite a bit, and this may date some of our audience, and it is Freddie the Pig series. Can you? I had never heard of this story. But
nobody's ever heard of Freddie the Pig. Well, Freddie the Pig is a pig detective, and so it was a series of detective books. And in each book, Freddie would solve another mystery. And for some reason, when I was a kid, they had all of these at my local children's library in Park Extension, where I grew up, and there was a big row of them. I remember them, and I just could not get enough of Freddie the Pig. I mean, they're well written. I remember them being sort of really engaging stories, and you know, I'd finish one and I'd go back to the library and I'd take the next one out, and so I often sort of credit Freddie the Pig for getting me started on wanting to be a writer. And it's kind of funny because I had sort of forgotten about Freddie the Pig, and then about 10 years ago I was back in Nova Scotia and I found this book in a secondhand bookstore, just in an old box under the stairs. I found this book and I went, oh my God, it's my old friend Freddie. And of course I had to buy it, and I like showing it to students because I like to show them just how important it is to be a reader if you want to be a writer. You know, all writers, I think, were avid readers right from the start, even when they were kids. And so for me, it was Freddie, and then we talked about Nancy Drew and some of the other, you know, books that were big when we were kids. And, you know, they give you the sense of narrative. I think that's what those books are good for. They teach you about storytelling. Even if maybe they weren't the best written books, they still can teach you a lot about what it takes to develop a story from beginning to end.
Well, you're going to have me looking now through the boxes when I visit these stores. You have an entire series. It's called Side Street.
Yeah.
And you've had Split. You told the students this took how many years?
Well, that was a 15-year on and off project. I mean, it was 15 years from when I started writing it, probably maybe even more than 15 till it was published. Because it went through many, many different revisions and permutations, but that was actually the second book I published in the series. The first one was this one, Klepto.
Yeah. Yes. Well, some of the students were asking about the
covers.
The cover page, how that came about. Like you have 2 different kinds here, cover pages.
Yeah,
right?
well, I find students are often interested in the whole issue of covers, like who gets to choose the cover. And I think they're often surprised to learn that the author really has nothing at all to do with the cover, with the design of the book. I mean, sometimes you're asked for your opinion, sometimes you're not. You can see with the Side Streets books, they really like the sort of single face cover that's consistent with all of their books. Tattoo Heaven, you see the image of the butterfly. Oh, the butterfly is the central image in this book. Yeah. But what's fun with Klepto is that I have some copies of some of the early designs. So, you know, this, I don't know if you can see it or not, but this little square here was the first design for the cover, and then it went from that to this, and then in the end it went from that to this. Okay. So they're related. All 3 are related, but it is a progression. It's obviously the same face.
But you've had it also translated into French,
yes,
right? And that's a very different cover from that.
Yeah.
I kind of like the pink.
I like the design of the French one as well. Yeah. I mean, that's obviously part of their series, that La Courte Échelle, this parkour series, and I think all of their books have that same color. It's sort of a purple and pink, and I like this one. She looks like she's been caught by the camera. I mean, you know, she's sort of hiding her face. And it's interesting that they both pick different scenes from the book to use as the cover image, but
Yeah. You mentioned that a lot of the ideas will come also from your own personal experience, not so much autobiographical, but you take from your experience rather than from outside. You had an interesting story about visiting your ancestors, or your father's family.
yeah, that was for the second book that was published, Split. When I was 9, I went back to meet my German family for the first time, basically my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, because my father had come to Canada at the age of 20 on his own. And one of the things that happened when I was there was my father took my sister and I down to the basement, and he actually showed us the hole that they had dug in the earth floor. There was now a sort of trap door, a wooden door covering this hole, and it's where they used to hide my father's sister just after the war, when, you know, that part of Germany was being occupied by the French. There was a fair amount of raping going on of young women in the town. And so they had built this hole in order to hide her if anybody came to the house. So obviously it was an image, a very powerful image that stayed with me all through my childhood. And I always knew that it was an image that I would use in a book. And so this book sort of centers on the father's experiences back in the war and how those affect him, you know, all those years later.
You're trying to interview your dad now for another book, and it's like pulling teeth, you said.
I'm working on another historical novel, and, you know, I know he has so much firsthand knowledge of what it was like to be a child living in Germany during the Second World War. So I'm trying to get detail out of him. Like I was saying to your class, I want to know what footwear he had. What did you wear on your feet? What did you eat? What did you listen to? If you listened to anything on the radio, like kind of what day-to-day life was like. Because, you know, you can read books about the history of the Second World War, but they do tend to focus more on the grander picture, the sort of details of what happened in the war and whatnot. But it's harder to get information, I find, on day-to-day life.
Yeah.
The best source is memoirs, so I've read a lot of memoirs. But I'd like to tap into his memories, but it's not a period that he is very comfortable talking about, understandably. I mean, you know, I'm sure it was a difficult time for him, and things happen that he doesn't want to return to. So every now and then he gives me a snippet.
Well, that's okay.
A little snippet here and there, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned to the students that your mother was, I guess, probably a book hoarder. Actually, your composition books.
Oh, yeah.
And she had them, and you still have them.
I still have them. She saved all of my elementary school composition books, which is lovely. You know, I mean, I filled booklet after booklet with stories. Some of them now, when I read them, they're so ridiculous, you know. But I guess those, you know, those are my early works. And she saved all of my, even through high school, all of the stories that I wrote. So I have actually a lot of my writing going way back, all the way to grade 1. No, which is fun, you know, and I would put together little books of poems, and I even have one where I sewed the spine with a thread and needle, and made my own little book of poetry. So yeah, I mean, it's my history, right?
It's really great.
Yeah.
So where else do you get your ideas from, if it isn't from your own personal background?
It's interesting. I found for my first few books, I drew way more heavily on my own experiences, my family experience, and I find as I'm going on in time, I mean, at a certain point, you kind of exhaust to a certain extent some of the trauma, you know, but I say all of the books still contain a lot of personal experience. I mean, things that happened to me or things that happened to close friends. Probably my new book, Picture Me, is probably the one that's in some respects the least personal. Although having said that, there's a bit of me probably in all three of the characters. But this one was based more on, I had seen an interview with some girls who were getting plastic surgery in order to try to resemble their favorite Hollywood stars. Paris Hilton, there was a 13-year-old girl who was getting plastic surgery in order to look more like Miley Cyrus. And you know, of course, all that struck me as incredibly sad, right? I mean, you have these young, beautiful women and feeling so bad about themselves, such poor self-esteem because they wanted to model themselves on these Hollywood stars. So that's kind of what I explored in this one. So probably this one's the least sort of personally connected to me.
Yeah, and these are all YAL books.
All
like
YA,
for
yeah.
teens, 13 and up about, I guess.
Yeah,
or a
I
bit
would say
older, maybe.
13 to 18, but I've had I've met strong readers who are 10, 11, who are reading YA. And actually, I find a lot of adults like YA.
Yes, they do.
I know a lot of adults who only read YA, you know.
Well, this is the book that our students here in
Yeah.
creative writing have read, and this is your first verse
Yes.
novel, right? So it's all written with quite a few different voices
Yeah.
here. And one of the things we had talked about is it's quite hefty a book. How did you keep these voices all in tow? I mean, I think I'd forget them.
I know. Well, like I told your students, I mean, I wrote it over about 3 years. So I would kind of create it a little bit piecemeal. You know, I'd write a spate of poems in different voices, then put it down for a while, then go back and write some more. So that was getting into the voice of the characters wasn't as hard as you would think once I'd established what their voices were. And it helped that each character has a different style of poem. So I don't know if your students noticed
I was
that.
looking for the Mary one, actually. I lost the page.
Like for example, when Christopher speaks, his voice always came out very narrow,
Yes.
long and narrow, and he himself is a tall, thin character. Mary's were all centered on musical themes. And this was totally the book designer who decided to put her poems within a sort of darker gray background, which I think works well. And then Stacy and Mark's poems are both sort of heavier, denser. So once I'd kind of established the voice for each of the characters,
It just, I guess,
it just came. Like I found that
together.
I was just able to slip into, okay, now I'm Christopher.
Would any
Yeah.
of these characters today recognize themselves in any of these books? Would they?
Maybe Mary a little bit. Possibly, if I were to. I mean, they're all kind of loosely based on people I knew in high school, loosely based. So, yeah, I suppose it's possible that if they picked up the book, they might recognize themselves.
Is there a favorite passage or a favorite piece that
Yeah,
you...
students like to ask that, like, which is your favorite book? And I always say that, you know, choosing your favorite book is like choosing your favorite child.
Okay.
You know, it's really tough to do. I'm attached to all of them maybe for different reasons. That one, I think, artistically was my most challenging because it combines poetry, so it has to have all the poetic elements, you know, the imagery, the metaphors. I really focused on rhythm. There's some poems in that, you know, book that have perfect rhythm. I focused on line endings. Not quite as much on plot, although that's what I ended up having to develop was plot. So artistically, I would say I'm maybe most attached to
Yes.
this one. Setting-wise, you know, If You Live Like Me is set in Newfoundland, which is a place I spent a little over 2 years in when my daughter was a baby, first born, and became so attached to. And it's, you know, it's a place that I love, and if I don't go back for a number of years,
The book will help you remember.
it will help me remember, and then when I reread the book, I start to miss it so much that I end up booking a plane. And
You deal with quite a few controversial issues, even in this book.
Yeah.
You know, which I think our students pretty much can identify with
Yeah.
because they're elements that deal. Was there one in particular that you questioned whether you would leave in there? I'm thinking of the scene, what is it, with Annabelle, or is it Annabelle who was pregnant, or her mother?
Well, Annabelle's mother had her when she was very young. Her mother got pregnant the year she graduated from high school. I think she was only 16, maybe 17. And because of that, Annabelle's mother is very nervous about Annabelle following the same path. So maybe she's, sort of overprotective and overcautious. But I kind of like that too, because I think often single parenthood is depicted in a really negative way in a lot of fiction and a lot of films. And I wanted to show that even though Annabelle's mother had her at a young age and was a single mom, she still did a great job, in raising this girl that clearly cares about the world. I mean, that's Annabelle's thing, right? Is working for social justice. She's smart, she has ambition. And maybe I drew a little bit there too, now that I'm thinking of it. My mother was a teenager when I was born. My mother actually had 2 kids in her teens. She was not a single mother. She was married to my father at the time, but she still had us very young.
Yeah.
And some of the memories, like there's a scene where Annabelle's mother remembers taking her to the park when she was a baby, and the way the other mothers would stare.
They weren't sure if she was a baby.
They weren't sure if she was a babysitter or the mother. And I remember my own mother saying that she often had that experience. And I almost feel like people wait for teenage parents to fail. And I didn't want to glorify it in any way, because obviously I wouldn't recommend it to anybody, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a disastrous, experience.
It could also be the reverse today, where a lot of, parents are waiting a lot later to have their children. So now people again are beginning to look at it and say, well, are you the mother or are you the
grandparent? Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
It's quite a situation. One of the things is that you leave the relationships open at the very end of the book. And some of the kids were saying, where's the ending?
Yeah, everyone wants to know. Yeah.
And we got the author here ask the question, and how come we don't have an answer?
Yeah.
And you don't, do you?
No, I mean, I really like that Mark and Mary hook up, however you want to interpret that they discover each other. And 2 characters that were so opposite at the beginning, you never in a million years would have pictured them even inhabiting the same, terrain in any way, that Mary ends up in his car, and that she's somebody he can confide in, and that she changes him by introducing him to Chopin, introducing him to this whole style of music that he'd never listened to before. And I think that's realistic. I think we take teenagers and we sort of slot them into boxes. You're this type of person and you're this type. And it's kind of interesting to think about what happens when they kind of cross-pollinate almost.
Yeah, so. With the creative writing class, you had a circle kind of with all the kids, and you heard some of their writing. What was your impression?
Excellent.
You're the author.
Yeah,
wonderful. I know
wonderful.
they're going to ask me.
Yeah.
What did she think when I read my piece?
No, I wish I'd had time to hear more, and I wish I'd had time to hear everybody's. But what I heard was a really strong sense of voice, which is what I was working on with them because of Yellow Mini. You want a narrator to sound distinct, and all of the pieces that they read had that quality of an interesting voice, an interesting narrator, great use of descriptive detail, which is something I think new writers forget about. Detail, the importance of detail. The detail has to be concrete. We want to see, we want to hear, we want to smell.
All the sensory detail.
All the sensory detail. And you heard me. I mean, that's what I told some of them, that in the rewrite, what you can think about now is not just how things looked, but how did they smell? How did they sound? Even that one girl, remember, she had the description of the tear coming down the cheek, and I kept wishing it would hit her mouth and she'd taste the salt.
And then her teeth could maybe, stick it in or something.
Yeah, that's it. But that comes with practice and awareness, And what I really wanted them to see was just how much work goes into one of these books. I compared it in the first session to a figure skating routine, where you see the person out there for 2 or 3 minutes or whatever. What you don't see are the hundreds and thousands of hours behind that skate, right? That led to that performance.
I think they were so amazed that you kept all the rejection letters. I'm amazed that somebody would reject some of the work. So it's, you know, I guess sometimes it must be a hit or miss as well. Maybe at the right moment, the right reader, you know.
Yeah, and an editor, what I think is often some editors are looking for a book that's already there, you know, already ready to go to print practically, and other editors are more like the editor that I encountered with my first books, Hadley Dyer, was great at recognizing the potential in a book, and she was willing to work with me to bring out that potential, whereas you have other editors who aren't willing to do that work. And of course those were my first books, so now I've gotten better at the whole rewriting process as well, but rewriting is a huge part of it. And like I told your kids, I mean, sadly, I know a lot of adult writers who I've met who have great talent, but they won't do the rewriting.
It's difficult, I guess. You know, it's like I've got my ideas down on paper.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness, now I have to think of how to correct it.
You really do.
You know, and it's not what you want to do.
Yeah.
Well, Laurie, I want to thank you so much on behalf of all the students that were here, and I know we have another session this afternoon with the secondary fours, so we have your books here in the library.
Excellent.
And I can tell you we're going to have a few more kids reading it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. It was
Thank you for
it's been a
coming.
nice day so far.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.